Jake Morrison allowed his true form to become fully visible for one terrifying moment. The human shape dissolved into something made of shadow and starlight, a figure that seemed to contain the final breath of every being that had ever lived. Stars died and were born within his form, and the sound of his presence was like the whisper of wind through empty spaces where civilizations used to stand. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cosmic horror faded away and Jake Morrison stood before them again in his simple black diplomatic suit. His eyes had returned to their normal color and his gentle smile was back in place. "I apologize for the dramatic display," he said, straightening his tie once more. "But I wanted you to understand exactly what you would be opposing if you choose to reject humanity." Speaker Vexthani stood slowly from her chair, her green scales pale with shock. Her voice shook as she spoke to the chamber. "The Galactic Council will now vote on humanity's membership application." "All those in favor?" The response was immediate and unanimous. Every hand, claw, tentacle, and crystal formation in the chamber rose into the air. Even War Chieftain Zraktor, aged and weakened as he was, managed to lift his trembling arm in support. "The motion passes," Speaker Vexthani announced. "Humanity is granted full membership in the Galactic Council, with all rights and privileges thereof. Ambassador Morrison, your species is welcome among us." Jake bowed formally to the chamber. "On behalf of all humanity, I thank the Council for this historic decision. I am certain that this alliance will benefit all our species for generations to come." Councillor Thexmari's crystal form had stopped pulsing with agitated colors and now glowed with steady blue light. "Ambassador Morrison, will you be remaining as humanity's permanent representative to the Council?" Jake shook his head with what seemed like genuine regret. "I'm afraid not, Councillor Thexmari. My diplomatic mission is now complete. It is time for humanity to make its own way in the galaxy, as it should be. They will be sending a new ambassador within the month." Dr. Patricia Collins stood up from her seat in the human delegation area. "Jake, what happens now? Will we see you again?" Jake's smile was warmer than any she had seen from him during their months of preparation. "You see me every day, Patricia. I am there at every birth when new life takes its first breath. I am there at every death when the old makes room for the new. I am there at every moment of transition, when one phase of existence gives way to the next. Humanity's future is now in their own hands, as it should be." Bobby Martinez found that his communication equipment was working again. Captain Bradley's voice crackled through the speakers, asking for a status update on the diplomatic mission. Bobby looked at Jake Morrison and realized he had no idea how to explain what had just happened. Jake walked over to the aged war chieftain Zraktor, who was sitting slumped in his chair. The mighty warrior looked up at the human diplomat with eyes that were clouded by centuries of forced aging. "I'm sorry it came to this, Zraktor," Jake said quietly, "but you needed to understand the seriousness of your actions." "Will I remain like this forever?" the war chieftain asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jake placed his hand on Zraktor's shoulder and immediately the alien began to look younger. The age spots faded from his scales. His claws grew back strong and sharp and his eyes cleared. Within moments he had returned to his original appearance. "Death can be delayed when there are lessons to be learned," Jake explained. "Your time will come eventually, as it does for everyone, but not today." War Chieftain Zraktor stood up, flexing his restored claws and testing his renewed strength. "Why did you heal me after what I did?" "Because striking death is not a crime worthy of eternal punishment," Jake replied. "It was simply a mistake born of ignorance and anger. You have learned from it, and that is enough." Speaker Vexthani approached the human delegation, her official demeanor softened by everything she had witnessed. "Ambassador Morrison, the Council will need time to process what has happened here today. Your species will receive full documentation of their membership rights and responsibilities within 48 hours. "Thank you, Speaker Vexthani. Captain Bradley is prepared to receive those documents and transport them to Earth immediately," Jake said. Lisa Harper finally found the courage to speak directly to the entity she had worked beside for months without truly knowing.
"Jake, were you ever really human at all?"
Jake looked at her with those kind eyes that she now knew had seen the birth and death of galaxies. "I wore Jake Morrison's form and tried to understand his memories and motivations. In some ways, I became more human during these months than I have ever been before. That experience has been invaluable to me." "What about the real Jake Morrison?" Dr. Patricia Collins asked. "What happened to him?" He died 3 years ago in a shuttle accident, just as the official records state. He was a good man who devoted his life to bringing peace between different groups of people. When I needed to understand humanity well enough to advocate for them, his memories and personality seemed like the perfect template to follow. The human delegation began gathering their materials and preparing to leave the station. As they walked toward the exit, Jake Morrison lagged behind the others. Counselor Mortek approached him hesitantly. "Lord Death," the blue-furred alien said formally, "will humanity truly be left to make their own decisions now?" "Please, just call me Jake," he replied with a laugh. "And yes, they will make their own choices from now on. I have given them the opportunity they needed. What they do with it is entirely up to them." As they reached the corridor leading back to their ship, Jake Morrison began to fade around the edges again. His form became less solid, more like a suggestion of a person than an actual physical being. "Thank you all for allowing me to travel with you," he said to the human delegation. "Take care of each other and remember that every ending is also a beginning." Lisa Harper reached out to shake his hand one final time, but her fingers passed through empty air. Jake Morrison smiled at her and nodded, then simply wasn't there anymore. Captain Bradley was waiting for them at the airlock, his face full of questions about how the negotiations had gone. Bobby Martinez handed him a datapad with the official council documents granting humanity full membership. "Sir, I need to file a report about our ambassador," Bobby said quietly. "What kind of report, Chief?" Bobby looked back down the corridor where Jake Morrison had disappeared. "I'm not sure, sir. Maybe Dr. Collins can help me figure out how to explain it." 3 days later, the UES Harmony entered Earth's solar system carrying news of humanity's acceptance into the Galactic Council. The celebration that followed was visible from space as cities around the world lit up with fireworks and parades. In a quiet government office, officials puzzled over their records. According to every database they had, Ambassador Jake Morrison had died 3 years ago in a shuttle accident. Yet he had somehow negotiated the most important diplomatic victory in human history. The final entry in the mission log was simple: "Diplomatic mission successful." Ambassador Morrison remained on station for personal reasons. New ambassador to be selected immediately. On Earth, in a small cemetery outside Boston, someone had placed fresh flowers on a simple gravestone that read, "Jake Morrison, devoted diplomat and father." The flowers were white lilies, traditional symbols of peaceful rest. In the distance, a figure in a simple black suit walked away through the gathering dusk. He had work to do, an eternal duty that called him to every world where life existed. But now he carried with him a deeper understanding of the species he had chosen to protect, and a quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. Humanity had been given its chance to join the galactic community. What they did with that opportunity would be entirely up to them, as it should be. After all, the most important choices were always the ones that beings made for themselves, knowing that every decision brought them one step closer to their inevitable meeting with the patient figure who waited at the end of all things. Jake Morrison smiled to himself as he faded into the shadows, ready to return to his timeless work with a renewed appreciation for the courage it took to live a mortal life among the stars. The silence that followed Jake's words was unlike anything the Galactic Council chamber had ever experienced. Even the background hum of the station's life support system seemed muted, as if the machinery itself was afraid to make noise. War Chieftain Zraktor sat slumped in a nearby chair, his body aged beyond recognition but still breathing, still alive. Speaker Vexi Thani was the first to find her voice, though it shook as she spoke. "If you are truly what you claim to be, why do you concern yourself with diplomatic negotiations? Why not simply command what you desire?" Jake Morrison's human form began to shimmer at the edges, like looking at someone through water. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from the air itself rather than his mouth. "Because commanding is not the same as earning respect, Speaker Vex Thani. I could force any outcome I desired, but that would teach nothing and help no one." Dr. Patricia Collins watched her instruments go wild as Jake's presence became more obvious to her sensors. The readings made no sense. Her equipment showed massive electromagnetic disturbances, temperature fluctuations that should have frozen or burned everyone in the chamber, and energy signatures that her databases had no way to classify. "Besides," Jake continued, his form stabilizing back into human appearance, "I am not here for myself. I am here because humanity stands at a crossroads that will determine not just their future, but the future of this entire galaxy. Counselor Thexamari's crystal form pulsed with rapid color changes, a sign of extreme agitation among her people. What do you mean by crossroads? Are you threatening us? Jake's laugh was genuinely amused, though it carried harmonics that made several alien species shiver. Threatening you? Counselor Thexamari. I have watched over this galaxy for millions of years. I have seen species rise to greatness and fall to destruction. I have guided the final moments of beings from 1,000 different worlds. Why would I threaten what I have spent so long protecting? He began walking slowly around the speaking platform, his movements now clearly inhuman despite his familiar appearance. Humanity is different from any species I have encountered. They are the only beings who have looked directly at me, recognized what I am, and chose to shake my hand anyway. Lisa Harper felt a chill as she remembered her first meeting with Ambassador Morrison 6 months ago. He had extended his hand in greeting and she had shaken it without hesitation. Now she wondered what she had really been touching. Other species fear death, Jake continued. They build their entire civilizations around avoiding it, delaying it, or pretending it doesn't exist. Humans do something remarkable. They accept that death is inevitable and then choose to live anyway. They choose to love knowing loss will follow. They choose to create knowing destruction awaits. They choose to reach for the stars knowing they might never return home. War Chieftain Zraktor managed to lift his aged head and speak, his voice now weak and raspy. If humans are so special, why do they fight wars among themselves? Why do they destroy their own world with pollution and weapons? Jake stopped walking and looked directly at the aged warrior. Because they are still young, Zraktor. Your people fought civil wars for 3,000 years before they learned to work together. The Crystalline Collective destroyed 4 of their own planets in resource wars. The Veltari hunted their own females to near extinction before they developed their current mating protocols. Again, Jake's knowledge of ancient history was impossibly detailed. These were events that had been deliberately erased from official records, known only to the highest levels of each species' government. Bobby Martinez found that he could move again and slowly reached for his communicator. He needed to contact Captain Bradley and warn him about what was happening, but when he tried to activate the device, nothing happened. All the human technology in the chamber had stopped working. I have been patient with humanity because I see their potential, Jake said, his voice growing stronger. In just 20 years of space travel, they have made contact with dozens of species and avoided major wars with all of them. They have established trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense pacts. They have done in 2 decades what took most species centuries to accomplish. Counselor Mortek spoke up from his section, his forearms trembling as he gestured. But their expansion rate is unprecedented. They claim new systems every year. How do we know they will not eventually threaten our own territories? Jake turned to look at the blue-furred alien with those unnaturally dark eyes. Because I will not allow it, Counselor Mortek. Just as I have not allowed the Korthani to expand beyond their current borders for the past 200 years. Just as I stopped the Veltari invasion fleet from attacking the crystalline homeworld 50 years ago. Just as I ended the Great War between the Saurians and the Metal Builders before it could destroy both species. The chamber fell silent again, as the implications of Jake's words sank in. Every major galactic event of the past several centuries, every war that ended unexpectedly, every invasion that simply stopped for no apparent reason, had been influenced by the entity standing before them. Speaker Vexathani's voice was barely a whisper. You have been manipulating galactic politics for centuries. Guiding, not manipulating, Jake corrected. I do not force choices upon anyone. I simply ensure that species have the opportunity to make better decisions when they reach critical moments. Sometimes that means ending a war before it destroys both sides. Sometimes it means introducing a new technology at just the right moment. And sometimes it means protecting a young species while they find their place in the galaxy. Dr. Patricia Collins finally found her voice. Why humanity? What makes them so different from all the other species you've watched over? Jake smiled at her, and for a moment his expression was entirely human and genuinely fond. Because they are the first species to befriend death, Dr. Collins. In their stories and myths, I am not always the enemy to be feared or defeated. Sometimes I am the friend who comes to end suffering. Sometimes I am the teacher who helps heroes understand the value of life. Sometimes I am simply the inevitable conclusion that gives meaning to everything that comes before. He gestured to the chamber around them. Every species represented here has created weapons designed to avoid meeting me. They have built medical technologies to delay our encounter. They have developed religions that promise to cheat me entirely. Humans do all of these things too, but they also do something else. Jake's form began to shift again, becoming more translucent, more obviously inhuman. They write poems about me. They create art that celebrates the beauty of endings. They tell stories where I am not the villain but simply another character in the great narrative of existence. They have made peace with mortality in a way that no other species ever has. The lights in the chamber dimmed as Jake's true nature became more apparent. His human disguise was fading away, revealing something that existed beyond normal matter and energy. Yet somehow his voice remained gentle and reassuring. That is why I chose to advocate for them. Not because they are perfect, but because they have the wisdom to understand that perfection is not the goal. They understand that it is the temporary nature of life that makes it precious. They know that it is the inevitability of endings that gives meaning to beginnings. War Chieftain Zraktor struggled to stand, his aged body shaking with the effort. And if we refuse them membership? If we vote against humanity despite your protection? Jake Morrison looked at the aged warrior with something that might have been pity. Then you will face the consequences of opposing a species under my personal protection, War Chieftain. And I assure you, those consequences will be far more permanent than a few extra years of age. The threat was delivered in the same gentle tone Jake had used for everything else, but it carried weight that made the entire chamber tremble. Several alien species began having difficulty breathing, as the presence of death filled the vast space with cold inevitability. War Chieftain Zraktor's massive form rose from his seat, his red scales gleaming under the chamber lights. His clawed hands gripped the railing in front of him so hard that the metal began to bend. The other Korthani delegates moved away from their leader, sensing the rage building inside him. I have heard enough lies from this human. Zraktor's voice boomed across the chamber. Speaker Vexathani, I present evidence that will end this farce once and for all. A holographic display appeared above the center of the chamber showing images and documents. The first image was of human soldiers in battle, their faces painted with skull designs. The second showed human religious ceremonies where people wore black robes and carried symbols of death. Behold the truth about humanity. Zraktor continued, his voice growing louder with each word. They are a species that worships death itself. Their military units carry names like Death's Head Squadron and Grim Reaper Company. Their religious texts speak of death as a friend to be welcomed. Their very culture celebrates the ending of life. More images flashed across the hologram. Human art depicting skeletons and graves, movie posters showing violence and destruction, even children's stories about death coming to take people away. To the alien council members, it painted a picture of a species obsessed with mortality. Jake Morrison stood quietly at the speaking podium, his hands folded behind his back as he watched the presentation. His expression remained calm, but Lisa noticed that the air around him seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. And now, Zraktor said, his voice reaching a crescendo, they send us this ambassador who speaks of things he should not know, who carries shadows that make our most sensitive species writhe in pain. This is no diplomat. This is a death dealer, a harbinger of the destruction that follows wherever humans go. The war chieftain stepped down from his platform and began walking toward the center floor. His heavy footsteps echoed through the suddenly silent chamber. I say that humanity should be cast out of council space immediately, before their death worship spreads to corrupt other species. Jake finally spoke, his voice carrying easily through the vast space without any amplification. War chieftain, every species in this chamber has symbols and stories related to death. The Veltari have their bone singers. The crystalline collective believes that death is simply another state of being. Your own people have the warrior's final march, where heroes choose to die in battle rather than live in dishonor. Those are honorable traditions, Zraktor snarled, now only 20 feet away from Jake. Not the sick obsession that drives your species to name their weapons after death gods and paint their faces like corpses. And what of the Korthani blood feast? Jake asked quietly. Where young warriors drink the blood of their defeated enemies to gain their strength? What of the Crimson Rites, where Korthani children are left alone with the bodies of their ancestors for 3 days, to learn that death comes to all? Zraktor stopped walking. Those were secret ceremonies, known only to the highest levels of Korthani society. They were never recorded in any document that alien species might access. How do you know of the blood feast? I was there, Jake said simply. The war chieftain's eyes went wide with rage. Impossible. Those rites are thousands of years old. You mock our most sacred traditions with your lies. I mock nothing, Zraktor. I have stood witness to the blood feast for over 4,000 years. I have seen 47 generations of Korthani warriors undergo the crimson rites. I watched your great-grandfather's great-grandfather take his first drink. From the ceremonial skull, the temperature in the chamber plunged. Frost began forming on the metal railings, and several alien species that were sensitive to cold started shivering uncontrollably. The lights flickered and went dim for a moment before returning to normal. Dr. Patricia Collins looked at her instruments in shock. Jake Morrison's body temperature was reading absolute zero, which was impossible for any living thing. More impossible still, her sensors were showing that there was no electromagnetic signature where he stood, as if he wasn't really there at all. War Chieftain Zraktor let out a roar of fury that shook the chamber walls. You dare to claim that you witnessed our most sacred rites? You dare to speak of my ancestors as if you knew them personally? I knew them better than you do, Jake replied, and now his voice carried harmonics that made several alien species cover their ears in pain. I was there when each of them died. I guided their spirits to whatever comes after. I have done the same for billions of your people across the centuries. Zraktor's rage finally overcame his reason. The massive alien charged across the remaining distance to the speaking podium, his clawed hand raised high. Liar, blasphemer! I'll show you what death really looks like. The war chieftain's armored fist swung down toward Jake's face with enough force to crush a human skull. Instead of dodging or defending himself, Jake Morrison simply stood there and let the blow land. The sound of metal striking flesh echoed through the silent chamber. For a moment, nothing happened. Then reality seemed to shudder. The lights in the chamber flickered again, but this time they didn't come back to full brightness. Shadows began moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move, stretching across the walls like living things. The air itself seemed to thicken, making it hard for some species to breathe. Jake Morrison hadn't moved from the blow. He hadn't even turned his head. Instead, he slowly looked up at War Chieftain Zraktor with eyes that had gone completely black from edge to edge. You should not have done that, Jake said, and his voice now came from everywhere at once, echoing from the walls and ceiling and floor. Zraktor tried to pull his hand back but found that he couldn't move it. He looked down at his armored gauntlet and watched in horror as it began to crumble away like ancient paper. The metal turned to dust that drifted away on a wind that no one else could feel. What is this? Zraktor whispered, staring at his bare hand where the gauntlet had been. This is what happens when mortals strike death, Jake replied. The war chieftain's hand began to change. Age spots appeared on the scales, spreading up his arm like spilled ink. His claws became brittle and started falling off one by one. The mighty warrior who had been in the prime of his life moments before began aging decades in seconds. Jake Morrison straightened, his diplomatic tie and smoothed down his black jacket as if nothing unusual had happened. Forgive the theatrics, honored council members, but some beings only understand power. The alien delegates sat in stunned silence as War Chieftain Zraktor stumbled backward. His once mighty form now stooped with age. His red scales had faded to dull brown, and his fierce eyes were clouded with the weight of centuries. I had hoped to conduct these negotiations without revealing my true nature, Jake continued, looking around the chamber at hundreds of terrified alien faces. But it seems that courtesy is not universal. Speaker Vexithani found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you? Jake Morrison smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, his expression seemed genuinely warm. I am the end that awaits all things, Speaker Vexithani. Some species call me Death, though I have worn many names across many worlds. I chose to walk among humanity because they fascinate me more than any species I have encountered in eons. The chamber erupted in chaos as aliens began shouting in dozens of languages. Some demanded explanations, others called for security, and a few simply screamed in terror. Through it all, Jake Morrison stood calmly at the podium, waiting for the noise to die down. Bobby Martinez reached for his weapon, but found that his hand wouldn't obey him. Neither would his legs or arms. He could only stand and watch as his carefully planned security protocols became meaningless in the face of something far beyond human understanding. Lisa Harper stared at the man she had worked with for months, realizing that she had never really known him at all. The gentle ambassador with the kind eyes and patient smile was something cosmic and ancient wearing human shape. As the chaos slowly died down, Jake Morrison looked around the chamber one final time. Now then, shall we continue with the negotiations, or would you prefer a different kind of discussion? The council chamber was enormous, with seats arranged in circles that rose up like a giant bowl. Each section was built for different types of alien bodies. Some seats were filled with water for aquatic species. Others glowed with heat for beings that needed high temperatures to survive. The human delegation sat in a small section near the center floor where Jake would address the council. Speaker Vexithani stood at the central podium, her green scales catching the light from above. Her voice echoed through the chamber as she spoke in the formal, council language that was automatically translated into each species' native tongue, the O. Galactic Council recognizes Ambassador Jake Morrison of the Human Federation. State your case for membership, human. Jake rose from his seat and walked to the speaking platform. As he moved, several aliens in the chamber shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few even moved their children behind them as if sensing some kind of danger they couldn't name. Honored council members, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Humanity comes before you not as conquerors or supplicants, but as neighbors seeking to join a community of civilized worlds. War Chieftain Zraktor stood up in his section, his massive form towering over the other Korthani delegates. He was covered in dark red scales with spikes along his arms and back. His voice was like thunder when he spoke. Neighbors who have conquered 12 star systems in 20 years, Zraktor said, pointing one clawed finger at Jake. Neighbors who fight wars among themselves even as they spread across space. The humans are deathbringers, and we should send them back to their homeworld before they poison our galaxy. Jake turned to look directly at Zraktor, and for just a moment his kind eyes seemed much darker than before. War Chieftain, your own people conquered 18 systems in their first 30 years of space travel. The Korthani-Veltar War lasted 60 years and claimed billions of lives. Yet here you sit as respected members of this council. The chamber fell silent. That war had happened over 300 years ago, and the records of it were sealed in the deepest archives. There was no way a human should know those details. Zraktor's eyes narrowed. How do you know of matters that predate your species' space travel? History has many teachers, War Chieftain. Some lessons are written in books, others are carved into the bones of worlds, Jake replied calmly. Counselor Thexamari rose from her crystal seat, her diamond-like form refracting light into rainbow patterns. When she spoke, her voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Ambassador Morrison, your words suggest knowledge that should not exist in human records. This council values truth above all things. How did you come by this information? Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Lisa noticed that the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. I have witnessed much in my time, Counselor Thexamari. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched species take their first steps into space, and observed the price of both peace and war. Experience is the greatest teacher of all. Dr. Patricia Collins leaned forward in her seat, studying Jake's biometric readings on her scanner. Something was wrong with the numbers. His heart rate hadn't changed at all during the stressful questioning. His breathing was perfectly steady, and his body temperature was lower than it should be. Most strange of all, her scanner kept losing his readings as if he wasn't there at all. Counselor Mortek spoke up from his section, his forearms gesturing as he talked. The human delegation speaks of peace, yet your military ships patrol the borders of 3 different species' territories. Your soldiers train for war even as your diplomats speak of friendship. Every species in this chamber maintains military forces, Jake said, looking around the room at the hundreds of alien faces watching him. The Veltari Third Fleet destroyed 2 Korthani colonies just last year over a mining dispute. The Crystalline Collective maintains battle stations in 14 systems. The Saurian Empire has the largest military in known space, yet all of you sit here together in council. Again, Jake's knowledge was too detailed and too accurate. Several council members began whispering among themselves, and more than one was looking at the human ambassador with fear, rather than curiosity. Speaker Vexithani raised her hand for silence. Ambassador Morrison, this council requires honest answers. Are you suggesting that humanity deserves membership because other species have committed acts of war? I am suggesting that humanity deserves membership Because we have learned from the mistakes of others, Jake replied. We have studied the histories of every species in this chamber. We have seen what works and what fails. We know the price of expansion and the cost of isolation. Bobby Martinez watched the crowd carefully from his position near the human delegation. Several alien security forces had moved closer to the chamber floor, and he could see weapons being readied in some sections. The mood in the room was turning hostile. War Chieftain Zraktor stood again, his voice even louder than before. You speak of learning from our mistakes, human, but your species worships death itself. Your entertainment glorifies violence. Your religions promise suffering, and your literature celebrates endings rather than beginnings. You are a species that has made peace with destruction. Jake turned to face Zraktor fully, and this time there was no mistaking the change in his expression. His eyes went completely black for just a moment before returning to their normal color. Several sensitive alien species in the chamber immediately began showing signs of distress, clutching their heads or making sounds of pain. Every species faces death, War Chieftain. The question is not whether you fear it, but how you choose to live knowing it waits for everyone. Humans choose to reach for the stars despite knowing they are mortal. That takes a courage that many species never find. Lisa noticed that Jake's voice had changed. There were sounds in it that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to make. Harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. She looked at her readings again and realized that Jake wasn't showing up on any of their sensors at all anymore. Counselor Thexamari's crystal form was pulsing with different colors now, a sign of agitation among her people. There is something deeply wrong here, she said, her voice carrying a note of fear. This being speaks truth that should not be known and carries presences that should not exist. I call for an immediate recess to investigate these irregularities. There will be no recess, War Chieftain Zraktor roared, pointing his massive arm at Jake. This creature has made a mockery of our council with its lies and tricks. I say we vote now to reject human membership and expel them from council space. The chamber erupted in noise as different species began arguing among themselves. Some supported the War Chieftain's position, while others called for more investigation. Through it all, Jake stood perfectly still at the speaking podium, watching the chaos with those strangely dark eyes. Speaker Vexathani slammed her ceremonial staff against the podium, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Order, this council will have order. As the noise died down, Jake spoke into the silence. His voice was quiet, but somehow everyone in the chamber could hear every word perfectly. I understand that my presence troubles some of you. That was not my intention. I came here hoping to secure humanity's place in this galactic community through honest diplomacy.
If that is not possible,
then perhaps it is time for a different kind of conversation. Dr. Patricia Collins felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Jake Morrison stand there calmly facing down hundreds of hostile aliens. There was something about him that she had missed, something that her scientific training should have caught earlier. Whatever Jake Morrison really was, she was becoming certain that he wasn't entirely human. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence as alien eyes studied the quiet human ambassador who somehow knew their deepest secrets and showed no fear in the face of their anger. War Chieftain Zraktor flexed his clawed hands, his red eyes burning with fury at the human who had dared to challenge the might of the Galactic Council. Something was about to break, and everyone in the chamber could feel it coming. The massive space station grew larger in the viewing screen as the UES Harmony moved closer to its docking bay. Jake Morrison stood at the window watching the alien structure that housed the Galactic Council. The station was bigger than any human city, and shaped like a giant wheel spinning slowly in the darkness of space. Lights from thousands of windows dotted its surface like stars. Lisa Harper walked up behind him holding a datapad in her hands. She was the mission's second in command, and had been working with Jake for 6 months preparing for this moment. Her blonde hair was tied back in the standard military style, and her blue uniform was pressed perfectly for the historic meeting ahead. Ambassador, we'll be docking in 30 minutes, Lisa said, looking at her watch. The welcome ceremony starts 1 hour after that. Are you ready for this? Jake turned away from the window and smiled at her. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed much older than his face. He wore a simple black diplomatic suit with the Earth Federation symbol on his chest. There was something calming about his presence that made everyone around him feel at peace. As ready as anyone can be for humanity's first formal meeting with 200 alien species, Jake replied with a small laugh. Have you reviewed the files on the council members we'll be meeting today? Lisa nodded and handed him the data pad. The most important ones are already loaded. Speaker Vexithani from the Saurian Empire will be running the session. She's 8 feet tall with green scales and very formal in her speaking style. War Chieftain Zraktor from the Korthani hegemony is the one we need to watch out for. Intelligence says he's been speaking against human membership for months. Jake scrolled through the alien profiles on the screen. Each species looked different from humans in strange and wonderful ways. Some had fur, others had scales, and a few seemed to be made of crystal or metal. He studied each face carefully as if he was memorizing every detail. What about Counselor Thexmari from the Crystalline Collective? Jake asked, pointing to a picture of a being that looked like living diamond. She's neutral on human membership but doesn't trust newcomers. The crystalline beings live for thousands of years, so they think in very long terms. To them, humans appeared in space yesterday, Lisa explained. Captain Steve Bradley's voice came over the ship's communication system. All hands prepare for docking. Diplomatic team report to airlock 3 in 15 minutes. Jake handed the data pad back to Lisa and straightened his tie.
How do you think this will go?
She asked him quietly. Every species in that council chamber has been where we are now, Jake said, looking back at the station. They all started as single-world civilizations that reached for the stars. Some succeeded through war, others through trade, and a few through pure luck. Humans have done all three. Lisa noticed something strange in his voice when he said that. It was like he had been there to see it all happen. But that was impossible since first contact with aliens had only been 20 years ago. Dr. Patricia Collins joined them at the viewing window. She was the team's alien expert and had studied every known species for the past decade. Her red hair was streaked with early gray from years of late-night research, and her green eyes were bright with excitement. I still can't believe we're actually doing this, Patricia said, shaking her head. When I was in college, we thought we were alone in the universe. Now we're about to join a galactic government. The universe is full of surprises, Jake said with that same strange tone in his voice. Most of them are good ones if you know how to look at them properly. Security Chief Bobby Martinez walked up to their group wearing his full dress uniform. He was a big man with dark hair and serious eyes who took his job of protecting the diplomatic team very seriously. Ambassador, I need to go over security protocols one more time before we board the station. Of course, Chief Martinez. What are your concerns? The station has over 50,000 aliens on it representing species that have been fighting each other for centuries. Some of them still are. My job is to make sure you come home safely, Bobby said, looking directly at Jake. I appreciate your dedication, Chief, but I don't think we'll have any problems. Diplomatic immunity is respected by all council members, and violence in the council chambers is forbidden by their oldest laws. Bobby didn't look convinced. Sir, with respect, you're betting your life on alien laws that might not mean the same thing to them as they do to us. Jake put his hand on Bobby's shoulder, and the security chief seemed to relax immediately. Sometimes you have to have faith that most people, human or alien, want the same basic things. Safety for their families, peace in their homes, and hope for their future. The docking alarm sounded and Captain Bradley's voice filled the corridor again. Docking complete. Diplomatic team to airlock 3. As they walked toward the airlock, Lisa noticed that Jake moved differently than other people. His steps were perfectly silent and he seemed to glide rather than walk. She had noticed it before, but thought it was just his diplomatic training. Now she wondered if there was something else about their ambassador that she didn't understand. The airlock opened with a soft hiss and they stepped into a corridor that was clearly built for beings much larger than humans. The ceiling was 20 feet high and the walls were made of some kind of smooth metal that seemed to glow with its own light. Alien symbols were carved into the walls in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. 3 aliens waited for them in the corridor. The largest was Speaker Vexithani, exactly as Lisa had described her. Her green scales reflected the corridor lights and her yellow eyes studied the human delegation with obvious interest. To her left stood a shorter alien covered in blue fur with 4 arms and large black eyes. On the right was something that looked like a walking crystal sculpture. Welcome to Council Station Centauri, beings of Earth, Speaker Vexthani said in perfect English that sounded like gravel in a metal bucket. I am Speaker Vexthani. These are my advisors, Counselor Mortek and Counselor Thexmari. Jake stepped forward and bowed slightly in the formal diplomatic style. I am Ambassador Jake Morrison, representing the Earth Federation and all of humanity. We are honored to be here. When Jake spoke, all three aliens stepped back slightly as if they had felt a cold wind. Speaker Vexathani's eyes narrowed and she studied Jake's face more carefully. There is something unusual about you, Ambassador Morrison, she said slowly. Something my people's senses are telling me that I do not understand. Jake smiled his gentle smile. I imagine there are many things about humans that will seem unusual to you, Speaker Vexathani. We look forward to learning about your people as well.